on the road, in the gym, at a coffee house. No matter where you listen, this is Prevention Perk. I'm Steve Miller with Mid-America PTTC. It's time to perk up our prevention efforts. My guest today is Sara Kohlbeck, who works at the Medical College of Wisconsin and is a co-host on the podcast The S Word. In her work, she focuses on suicide prevention among veterans, farmers, and marginalized populations, including Black and Latinx individuals living in urban areas. Her research is focused on better understanding farmer suicide through qualitative methods, including photovoice. Sara is a Milwaukee resident with her husband, 2 children, and her rescue dogs, Brisco and Ollie. Sara Kohlbeck, welcome to Prevention Perk.
Thanks so much for having me. I'm happy to be here.
Well, my first question always with our guest is, we know you're doing prevention work around suicide, and I'm always curious, how did you get into this work?
That's a great question. And it's a story that I don't get to tell often, so I appreciate being able to talk about it here. So working in prevention is a second career for me. I started out when I graduated from college as a teacher. I taught Spanish in middle school and high school. And after a few years of doing that, kind of decided to make a shift. It wasn't quite for me. And so took a little bit of time off to kind of recalibrate, figure out what I wanted to do after my youngest son was born. And I stumbled into public health. One of my very close friends was working in public health at the time when I met her, and we were actually running buddies, and we would spend hours and hours running together. And over the course of those hours, I learned about her job, learned about the work that she did, and was very intrigued. I had never heard of public health. I knew that prevention was, obviously something that's been done. I guess I always thought of it in terms of, vaccines and infectious disease, which is certainly a component of prevention. But I guess I didn't realize how expansive prevention work is. And so the more I learned about public health from my friend Renee, the more I felt like it sounded like something I wanted to engage in and learn more about. So I went back to school, I got my master's and then eventually my PhD in public health. And it's turned into my life's calling. When I was working on my degree, suicide prevention specifically spoke to me. A lot of folks that were in my cohort in my master's and my PhD program were focusing on, maternal and child health, and global health and cancer, all very, very important health topics. And what I noticed is that not a lot of people were focusing on mental health related issues and thinking about prevention. I think that when we think about an issue like suicide, we tend to think about it in the space of something that's not necessarily preventable. And the mission of my work is to change that perception. It's really to bring awareness to the notion and the idea and the fact that suicide is preventable. It can be prevented. I have my own lived experience of pretty significant mental health issues and suicidal ideation. And for me, understanding that this is a preventable health issue has been pretty revolutionary in my own personal life. So it's both, a professional passion as well as a personal passion for me.
It's interesting that you say that. I've taught the mental health first aid, both for adults and for teens for a number of years. And I'm always surprised at the number of people that will say that, if someone reaches the point where they have suicide ideation, there's really nothing that you can do. And I'm not an expert in it. So my response usually is then can you explain to me why we're all here today?
Right.
Because that's the turning point, is the more people that have eyes on one another, so to speak, when it comes to our mental health, the better equipped it will be to maybe make a difference in someone's life.
Yeah, absolutely.
I think we can turn the corner now. We can't do that for them, but anyone can turn the corner given the right set of circumstances, tools, support, that kind of stuff. You're listening to Prevention Perk. The funder of this project, along with all the other products of the Mid-America PTTC, is the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration. Although funded by SAMHSA, the content of this recording does not necessarily reflect the views of SAMHSA. You'll find several resources about suicide on the SAMHSA website. To learn more, visit samhsa.gov/suicide. I really found it interesting that, you're doing suicide prevention, but you have an interest in veterans and farmers and marginalized populations. And I want to break that down a little bit as we kind of talk. But since we spend a lot of time around substance use prevention through the Mid-America PTTC, I wondered if maybe you could talk a little bit about your work and how there's a correlation between substance use and suicide.
Yeah, and another great benefit to the work of prevention is being able to look at those intersections of these different health issues and, how they influence and affect each other. A lot of the work that I've done here in the state of Wisconsin has focused on the intersection of alcohol use and suicide in particular. In our state, we have a very, very strong, deeply embedded alcohol culture, as is the case in many other states as well. And unfortunately, we see alcohol present in many, many suicides that occur in our state. Alcohol acts in a couple of different ways in terms of suicidal behavior. One, it kind of reduces folks' inhibition, and so somebody that may have been contemplating suicide but didn't have a plan, when alcohol is involved or other substances are involved, that inhibition is reduced, and so there's that impulsive decision that can be made. We also know that people that are dealing with mental health issues sometimes use alcohol as a coping strategy. And so, you have that increased use of alcohol that then, can sort of increase the potential risk if there's an acute crisis. We do also look at other substances and how they intersect with suicide. Certainly, we know that many suicides that occur are, the direct result of an overdose. It was an intentional overdose. We see substances including, prescription substances that folks are on, non-prescription illicit substances as well. So there definitely is a strong link between substance use and suicide, in addition to just the fact that, these are often co-occurring issues, substance use and mental health issues. And so my hope is that in the future, we start to regard alcohol in particular, but other substances as a lethal means, the same way we talk about firearms as a lethal means in suicide, and that we need to approach environments with an eye towards safety when somebody is in a mental health or suicide crisis.
Well, that's interesting. I'm a person in long-term recovery, and one of the things that's often talked about, and I've heard this all the time that I've been in recovery, is that sometimes drug use is just a very slow, prolonged form of suicide, and people aren't aware of that. It's looked at as like, well, he could do something about that if he wanted to, or you know what I mean? But there's, as you're saying, there's a correlation, and there's probably an underlying mental health component to that, that one drives the other. And it's like, which came first, the chicken or the egg? I don't know what matters in this case. Let's take a look at whatever's going on and see if we can, find a resolution to it. I think it's interesting also that, I can tell you're very passionate about what you said. This has kind of become your life calling, if you will. You have a podcast out there called The S Word. Let's talk a little bit about that and what that experience has been like, because it sounds like you and I have been in the podcast world about the same amount of time. Talk a little bit about your podcast. Maybe people can find it, and just how that's going for you.
Yeah. The podcast was really born that a colleague and I have to share information that is sometimes not shared with the general community. I work in an academic setting, and understand how inaccessible research findings can be, both from, the perspective of a lot of these findings are behind paywalls. People can't access academic papers. and also because they're just scientific and really hard to read. So our kind of goal with the S word is to take what is in the research literature, what people have learned about this issue, and make it available to community members in a way that it can be understood. Make it available to, folks that are working in suicide prevention. So we talk to experts from around the country about different facets of suicide and even suicide loss. We had a really great episode that involved an expert discussing, kind of the complicated grief that's associated with experiencing a loss by suicide. So we try to, sort of take, like I said, the academic literature and make it a little bit more accessible in a way that, people can listen in their car on their way to work or whatever they're doing, easily consumable. I think one of the other drivers behind the S word is stigma reduction. The name, the S word, is intentional because people are, not necessarily talking about suicide. Yeah, it's hush hush. And so we have this, podcast, the S word, a podcast about suicide prevention, and we're really trying to open up those conversations and make this a topic that people talk about. We have had a number of guests that have lived experience either of suicide loss or are, suicide attempt survivors who talk about their experience and what they've learned. And I think in that sharing of stories, I hope anyway, that we are making people feel less alone in this space. It can be very lonely and isolating and scary if you're having these thoughts. And I think knowing that others out there have had these same experiences makes the experience a little bit less lonely.
Yeah, I find that interesting. I'm no expert on any of this, but in my teaching with the mental health first aid and my first introduction to it, the thing that I pulled out of it was, well, this is fantastic from the standpoint that it's addressing the stigma that nobody really wants to say that suicide or someone's depressed or that they have anxiety. They might if they're joking about it, but it's almost like if you talk about it in a real sense, it's almost like you're reinforcing it. I mean, I've heard that over and over and over again, and you can speak to it, but if you talk about suicide, they might do it.
Yeah. Yeah, and that is a very common misconception. It's something that I, grew up thinking and have heard many, many times over my life. And the reality is that you're not going to put the idea in somebody's head if you bring up suicide, especially if you're concerned about somebody. What you are going to do is let that person know that they're cared for. And so even if you're, concerned about somebody and you say, are you thinking about taking your own life? Even if the answer is no, that person knows that that you care enough to ask. And that social support is really key.
Yeah. Talking about it, I think we can't do too much of. Maybe
Right.
you can at some level, but a lot of these things are just, it always kind of amazes me that the things that we're not supposed to talk about sometimes are the things that we need to talk about the most, if not for ourselves, maybe to the benefit of someone else. And that's what I like about the podcast realm is you can explore these things. And
Yeah.
I appreciate it. You didn't say it, but I appreciate the work that you're doing because it dumbs it down for someone like me. It is complicated reading to get through some of
Mhm.
that high level research, but to be able to break it down and pull out the things that the general public needs to know, and then we can talk about it. So I think that's fantastic.
Thank you.
You have talked about, we talked about when I read your bio that you look at a lot of subpopulations, and I thought maybe we'd spend some time talking about it mentions veterans, farmers, marginalized populations. Um, what I think is interesting is years ago, I used to work for public television, and there was a series called The Farmer's Wife. And I grew up in a rural setting, but I wasn't a farm kid. So, I mean, and I remember even growing up thinking, that's a hard life. And I can remember, even seeing how there was a lot of struggle to
Mm-hmm.
make ends meet and that kind of stuff. And that's not to minimize it. I mean, I have, good friends that's their profession to this day. I just would think that. And then I saw that television series and I remember thinking, wow, I knew, it's like, certain people and you think that's this way. But then when you see that this is really a huge issue, and one of the things that drew out was the farmer's kind of struggles with his emotional
Mhm.
landscape. It didn't hint at any of the thing we're talking about today, but I thought let's talk a little bit about that, especially since it looks like you have kind of a need to better understand farmer suicide. So,
Yeah.
and then you says both qualitative methods, and then you use photo voice. So,
Mhm.
can we talk a little bit about that work? But then, how are you using photo voice?
Yeah. Well, the two are linked actually. So, I was born and raised in Wisconsin. I live in Wisconsin, the dairy state. We have a large number of farms in our state. I also grew up in a rural community. My grandparents were dairy farmers in the 70s and 80s. And so I had the unique um, opportunity to kind of experience that life, up close and personal. I really, I think, as I've gotten older, have romanticized that a lot. As a very kind of idyllic time in my own life, and having so much fun, and playing with my cousins and seeing all these cool things on the farm. And as I've gotten older, realizing really how difficult that work is. Here in Wisconsin, unfortunately, um, we have a situation in which our farmers are overrepresented in suicides in as compared with kind of their overall distribution in the population. So we have, 1% of our workforce is farmers here in our state, but they comprise, 2% of all the suicides. So that's an issue. There's been quite a bit of media attention as well in recent years around, mental health crisis in farming. We see major stressors like severe climate related events that are decimating, crops. We see really dramatic swings in commodity prices. We see, large kind of industrial farms, taking over from small family farms. And so there are just a number of stressors that are influencing the life of a farmer. And so I, from my own personal experience as well as my, professional, I think, recognition of a need to work in this space, decided to actually my dissertation focused on farmer suicide in Wisconsin. And so, part of that involved looking at suicides that occurred among farmers in our state to identify potential opportunities for prevention. But also, I talked to current farmers. I, mainly conducted interviews during the pandemic, so it was a lot of, phone calls and Zoom chats. But I also did go to some farms to talk to farmers and ask them, what is your experience? What is causing stress in your life? And how do you manage those? How do you deal with those so that we can try and bolster those strengths and supports in a way that might prevent suicide? And that's where the photo voice came in. Photo voice is a qualitative research method that allows people to kind of capture through photos the context of their own lived experience. And for farmers who, may feel a sense of stigma around talking about issues of mental health, might not be as willing to talk about it, might be willing to take some pictures of their experience and allow us to kind of learn about what they're experiencing that way. So we did interviews with farmers, and then we asked those farmers if they would be willing to just take some pictures of what stressful situations look like to them, and then what supportive environments look like to them. And so it was fascinating to see what folks came up with. And this paper was actually just published this week, so it's out there and available for everybody. It's open access. Um, it was fascinating, and I learned so much from talking to people that I think helped me and hopefully, folks that read this research have a little bit of a better understanding of what's going on in the lives of our farmers.
Well, I'm certainly glad that you said it's now available, because my follow-up question was going to be, how could we, have a bird's eye view of all this? I think that would be interesting to see what the individuals were able to capture, and then how you're able to kind of portray that, because I'm familiar with photo voice, but a lot of people may not be. And I think that'd be a great way to get introduced to both of these subjects. What is
Yeah.
that? And what would it look like to incorporate that into any subject matter? It could be suicide awareness or prevention, or it could be, drug prevention, or
Yeah.
take your pick. I think that that's really interesting. So that's your biggest interest, because it talks about marginalized populations. What other
Yep.
work are you doing besides around, the farming community?
Yeah, as you mentioned, I do quite a bit of work with the veteran population as well, and preventing suicide among veterans. Part of my work here involves time over at the VA Medical Center here in Milwaukee, and working with and learning from veterans. And I think, interestingly, a lot of farmers are veterans, and some of the sort of cultural issues that farmers experience are very similar to that of veterans, particularly as it relates to firearm use and access. And so there are parallels that can be drawn between the two groups. So, I'm working on a couple of projects right now that are focused on veteran suicide prevention. And then the marginalized population piece. So I live and work in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, which is one of the most segregated cities in the entire country. We have seen suicide among Black men in our community, particularly young Black men in our community, increasing. And suicide is always a tragedy. But I think in particular, this, I don't want to call it a trend, but this scenario that we're seeing in our community requires a different focus than we typically use when we're looking at suicide in farmers and veterans, for example. It's a different set of stressors, it's a different context, and we can't apply the same prevention strategies. So really a lot of our work is around understanding, how these stressors are manifesting in the lives of young Black men. How their experiences with things like discrimination and structural racism play into their suicide risk, and really bringing that to the attention of folks that are working in this space. Like, we can't be applying the same prevention strategies to young Black men in Milwaukee than we do to, white farmers in Shawano, Wisconsin. So it's different, and we need to acknowledge that.
So I think I understand this, that there's across the board, there's an increased either ideation or attempted suicide or completion of suicide nationwide.
Mhm.
Are there more people like you that are taking more of an interest in this? Is this a growing body of work? Yeah. You know what I'm saying? I mean, if there's a need out there, are there more and more people that are trying to address that need? Do you have a sense for that?
Yeah, I do. So I'm a member of the American Association of Suicidology, which is, a professional organization of folks like me that are doing this type of research. And it seems to me that membership is growing. I'm excited to go to our annual conference coming up in April. And it's always interesting to see, particularly younger students that are coming into the field with an interest in this work. It's hard work. It's emotionally taxing work. But it's always really encouraging to see, new people interested. I also mentor students that are, either graduate students or medical students that have an interest in suicide prevention, and there's no shortage of people interested in this work. So you're right. I mean, we are unfortunately seeing increases in, suicide rates as well as attempts and ideation, particularly in younger folks. So it's really encouraging, like I said, to see interest among younger folks in this work as well.
Well, one of the things that caught my eye, and you may not have anything to speak to this, but I thought it would be interesting to explore. You have two rescue dogs. You have Brisco and Ollie.
I
So
do.
I want to talk a little bit about them. You can talk about your kids as well, but Brisco and Ollie because you rescued them. But is there? Can you talk to maybe the benefit of animals and suicide prevention?
Yeah, I can speak to that both personally and professionally. Brisco was a dog that we adopted right after I went through a pretty difficult, prolonged um, time when I was having suicidal ideation. And when we adopted him, he was an unexpected source of support for me. There's just something about, being able to sit down and, have this being that is demonstrating unconditional love that's always there. And to some extent relies on you. I think that kind of is supportive in a way too. Like, I have this dog relying on me. And so, I need to be strong and step up and, take care of him. I think that helped me for sure. And we see things like service dogs being used with veterans to help them manage some of the symptoms of their PTSD, for example, or some of their other mental health issues. We also see, sometimes when a person loses a pet, how difficult that is. And unfortunately, we see that it's sometimes as kind of an immediate stressor that, precedes a suicide. And so I think we can't underestimate the power of pets in our lives. I mean, it's not for everybody, but certainly, in my own life, and I know in the lives of others, these pets have just been lifesavers.
Yeah. So how's Ollie fit into that? Ollie just happened to come along as the
He's
second
our
rescue.
pandemic dog. Yeah, Ollie's our pandemic. We wanted to get a pet for Brisco, basically.
Yeah.
So we didn't want him to be by him. So he's great. He's much more my daughter's dog than mine. But he's just a lovable doofus. He's great.
Now, what kind of dogs are they?
We call them Oklahoma mixes because they both came from Oklahoma. They're mixes of Brisco is Staffordshire Terrier and Australian cattle dog, and Ollie's got some Siberian Husky in him. So they're a mix of everything, but they are very lovable.
They're dogs. That's what I like. They're just dogs, They don't have to have a title, so to speak. So, well,
Right.
that's great. So I try to promote this anytime we get a chance to talk about it. As of this past summer, getting connected to mental health services in a crisis situation has become exponentially easier with the advent of 988. And it's so interesting the number of people that have spoke to me about how, not necessarily in all cases themselves, but someone that they know that was connected and the experience they had through 988. And I wondered if maybe you could talk a little bit about access to 988, what that means, and do you know how maybe that's impacting suicide at this point, or is it too early to tell? Is there research around it?
Yeah, so 988, it's a wonderful resource, and I'm so glad that so the Suicide Prevention Lifeline has been available for many years, but the transition to the three-digit dialing number 988 just makes it so much easier for people to remember and be able to dial. I think one of the things that is great about 988 is it's not just for people in a suicide crisis, even though it's really thought of as kind of the suicide crisis lifeline. You don't have to be in suicide crisis to call 988 or to text 988. It can be any sort of mental health crisis, life crisis, and they can help direct you to resources if needed. We have a great relationship here in Wisconsin with the provider of 988 services. And they've talked to us about the increase in calls that they've seen over the last year, particularly since 988 was, announced. And I think that, I don't know that we know yet the impact of the transition to 988 on suicide rates, but I do know that there's that increased engagement, which is important. I think the addition of the texting feature as well is really great. There are a lot of people out there that don't like to talk on the phone, that aren't comfortable talking on the phone, especially about a topic like this. And so being able to text 988 and be connected with the same services you would if you had called is really critically important. So, yeah, I mean, I know that in our state, we're starting to roll out more messaging around 988 to make it more, to build awareness and again, try and get people to recognize that this is a resource that, is available all the time and it's free. So yeah, I'm glad that we're talking about it here today, because I feel like the more people know about it, the better off we're going to be.
Yeah, I like I said, I've heard a couple of people report of a family member that accessed it, and just to hear them kind of recount, it's like you're hearing about it afterwards, but like the individual that made the call, like I did not expect that. Like they felt
Mhm.
like the person on the other end of the phone was going above and beyond in a way that they couldn't have imagined, and one of
Yeah.
the scenarios was just somebody that really was dealing, because of some life circumstances, some extreme anxiety and panic attacks for the first time, and in at an older age, into their 50s, not
Mhm.
really knowing what to do. And they were like, I just could not believe that this person was willing to do these things and help me get connected to services and all that. And I thought, I've never had to call a crisis line before, and I don't know if that's always been the case, but for it to be happening as quickly as it seemed like it did, to me signaled that the word was getting out. So
Good.
I'm hoping
Yeah.
that that's continuing to be the case.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, it's been encouraging to see. And I know, wait times are, to go see, a psychologist or psychiatrist or a therapist are incredibly long right now in a lot of places. And so having that kind of real-time resource available is very helpful.
You're listening to Prevention Perk. If you or someone you know is struggling or in crisis, help is available. Call or text 988 or chat 988lifeline.org. There are a wealth of resources available about 988 on the SAMHSA website. The more we know, the better equipped we are to save a life. There's a link in the show notes, or search SAMHSA 988. Well, thank you for being here. I appreciate what we talked about. I always like to give the guest kind of the last word, so to speak. Is there something that we didn't talk about, or that you maybe just want to reemphasize and say, in regard to, suicide awareness or prevention, that you want to share with our audience?
Yeah, I think for folks that are listening that might be either dealing with their own mental health issues or maybe supporting somebody else in their life that is dealing with mental health issues, I just want to say that you're not alone. There are a lot of us out there um, that understand what you're going through and that are willing to support. And so if you are ever feeling alone, just remember that we're all out here. Might not always be visible. We might not always be the loudest voices in the room, but we're here and you're not alone.
So there are a number of resources through SAMHSA, and I always put those in the various show notes, and some of the mentions that I'll pepper in through this podcast. But do you have a favorite resource that maybe people can learn more about this? We'll make sure we get them connected to your photovoice, but other places that they might learn more about suicide prevention.
Absolutely. I would highly recommend checking out the American Foundation for Suicide Prevention's website. That can be found at afsp.org. There is just a treasure trove of information about suicide prevention, and also loss and healing. I think a population that maybe isn't always considered is the population of folks that have lost somebody to suicide. There are tremendous loss and healing resources on AFSP's website. It's very accessible, lots of great information. It also can connect you with an AFSP chapter in your state. Just about every state has a chapter. And so if you're interested in getting involved further, you can volunteer, you can find trainings, all kinds of really great information on the American Foundation for Suicide Prevention site.
That's great. Thank you. I appreciate you being here today. Our guest has been Sara Kohlbeck. Thanks for being a guest on the Prevention Perk.
Thanks for having me. It's my pleasure.
And thank you for listening to Prevention Perk, a podcast from Mid-America PTTC. To learn more about our innovations, visit pttcnetwork.org and look under your PTTC for the Mid-America link. Remember, prevention is better together, and together we are stronger.